Following Stalin's failed blockade, the situation in Europe gets more and more tense. One of the consequences of the blockade was it heightened America's determination around the world to stand up to communism. The United States, France, and England accelerate their move towards creating a united West German country. That, of course, also means that the Soviets will accelerate their move towards creating their communist society. And what ends up happening is not only is it having consequences in Europe, but also in the rest of Europe. In fact, both the United States and the Soviet Union begin permanent military alliances. In fact, the United States will break from its tradition of avoiding entangling alliances and will join and head up and lead a permanent military alliance in the form of NATO. The Soviets will follow that up with their own military alliance known as the Warsaw Pact. So you have these two sides basically creating these alliances.
We've got a job to do. Let's go police the world.
NATO represented in the green on this map, or whatever color that happens to be. And initially, in April of 1949, 10 nations sign on, the United States, Canada, and a bunch of countries in Europe. And what it states is an attack on one of us is considered an attack on all of us. And so you have this situation in which this is the first time ever, the United States joins a permanent peacetime military alliance. We are officially no longer isolationist. We are in this thing. We are going to end U.S. isolationism. The whole Washington avoiding stuff, we're going to do it. In fact, Congress gives a bunch of money. A bunch of other countries join.
We've got a job to do. Let's go police the world.
And NATO is still around today, and the U.S. does play a role in it. Now, what does it stand for? North Atlantic Treaty Organization. As you can see, Canada, U.S., many other countries. Many of these join later on, but it starts off with 10. And the U.S. has 4 American Army divisions in Europe. Dwight Eisenhower, the hero of D-Day in World War II, he's going to sign up to be the commander, the supreme commander of that organization. On the flip side, the Soviets create their own East German state and create their own alliance known as the Warsaw Pact. And basically the Warsaw Pact is going to include the Soviet Union, which is huge, and its various satellite countries, the countries behind the Eastern Bloc. They didn't really have a choice in whether or not they joined, because remember, they have pro-Soviet puppet governments. So you have now Europe divided between 2 armed military camps. You have the Soviets in the Warsaw Pact, and you have in the brown the United States in the NATO. 1949 is a very tense year. The Cold War heats up. And there's a couple of things that happen that make the United States get very nervous. One, 1949, the Soviets test their first atomic bomb. Up until that point, we had a monopoly on atomic weapons. And we thought we were going to have that for a little bit longer. We knew that they were trying to build up their atomic bomb, but they detonated in 1949 well ahead of what we thought was the schedule they were on. Then, the biggie, China turns communist. Shocks the American public, shocks the Truman administration. No one thought that China could fall to the communists. And then, not too long after that,
ladies and gentlemen, let's get ready to rumble!
the Korean War begins in 1950. All three of these events are all unrelated in many ways, but yet it is going to lead to a huge reaction in the United States. There is the first atomic bomb test in September of 1949. Like I said, the US knew they were trying to build that bomb. They had been spying on us during World War II. We did not include them in the Manhattan Project. Suddenly now, they got this thing a lot quicker than we thought they would get it. And of course, what's going to happen, and we'll reference this in other chapters, is there's going to be a huge nuclear arms race. The United States and the Soviet Union are going to dramatically increase their stockpiles of weapons, missile sites around the world. Missile sites in Turkey, the U.S. will place weapons in. The Soviets will eventually place weapons in Cuba. So you have this kind of arms race that is a part of the Cold War. Of course, this is still an issue that is hovering over world affairs, with different countries such as North Korea, Iran, and others trying to build up their programs, and also others that have in the past. This map's a bit old, but Libya, Algeria had been rumored. But these are, the blue are current declared atomic powers. So you have all this stuff happening. In another chapter, I'll get into it, but you have this widespread fear in this country of an atomic war. They have actual duck and cover drills where kids are taught how to, duck and cover in case of an atomic bomb. People built bomb shelters in their homes if they could afford it to hopefully save themselves in the event of a nuclear attack. And of course, here are kids practicing the necessary steps just in case there's a bomb. And of course, you all know that if there is an atomic bomb or a nuclear attack, that hiding under your desk with your hands behind your head will, of course, save you. In fact, you have this buildup of this fear in this country, paranoia in many cases, people reading up on how to survive an atomic attack, people building these bomb shelters with their canned water and their canned food, people at school doing the duck and cover drills, so on and so forth. If you have time, Google duck and cover, Bert the Turtle, best video ever. Now what's important to understand is in this period, the Cold War starts off in Europe, but is going to transfer over to Asia. The battle between the US and the Soviet Union over influence of Europe, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, is not going to be confined to just that region. The United States and the Soviet Union are going to be competing for influence and control over Asian territory. You're going to have battles going on in China, Korea, later on Vietnam, and various other places. And what ends up happening is China was actually in a struggle, a civil war amongst themselves, even before World War II. And you had two different sides, and actually a little bit way more complex than that, but you had different sides. You had the nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek, who had support that was not exactly very enthusiastic. He was basically not very popular, and he was challenged by a communist by the name of Mao. And during World War II, when Japan invaded China, Manchuria, and the rest of China, these two sides kind of came together to resist the Japanese invasion. Mao really kind of gets a name for himself as being one of the big resistors of Japanese domination. And when World War II ends, the Chinese Civil War begins again. We're not going to get into all the different kind of intricacies of this thing. Just know that Truman was really supporting these guys, the nationalists. Why? Because they're not communist. And what ends up happening is the U.S. is giving something like $3 billion to the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek, hoping that they'll win this thing, hoping that China will not go communist. And unfortunately for the US and Truman, Chiang Kai-shek is ineffective as a leader. And what ends up happening is in 1949, Mao, who has the control of the peasant farmer population, declares the People's Republic of China. Huge blow for the US. We had been trying to keep China from going communist, and suddenly now in 1949, Chiang Kai-shek flees to Taiwan. China now is a communist country. And what this does is it sends shockwaves throughout the United States. How could this nation, the most populous nation in the world at the time, how could it have been lost to the communists? People ask that question. Who lost China? Truman must have been being weak on communism. The Soviets have won. Now what you need to realize, very important point, China was not collaborating closely with the Soviet Union. Mao and Stalin were not exactly best friends. And the situation in China, the communists coming to power in China, was the result of the conditions in China and the situation that existed in China even before the Cold War. And America could have done very little to actually stop this. We did a lot to try, billions of dollars. It failed. Nevertheless, the loss of China to the communists is seen as a huge defeat for Truman and for the United States. Add to the fact that in 1949, the Soviets had detonated their atomic bomb. There's this belief that somehow we were not invincible, that our illusion was lost in 1949. And what you see happening is there's this belief in this domino theory, this idea that if one country falls to the communists, other countries will follow. Just like dominoes, the first one falls, and those surrounding it fall as well. And so you have this kind of belief that when China falls in 1949, that other events around China are linked to that. For instance, 1950, June, North Korea, communist North Korea, is going to invade South Korea. It must be a communist conspiracy taking over. Also in the 1950s, a guy by the name of Ho Chi Minh is going to be leading a communist revolution against the French in Vietnam and Indochina. And when the United States is looking at this, looking at the world in Asia, they're looking at Korea, they're looking at China, they're looking at Vietnam, it must be part of some big conspiracy. Stalin and Mao must be working together. Slowly picking off countries to the communist cause. The dominoes were falling. And what Truman and other presidents are going to believe is that you must stand up to this communist aggression. And it all must be directed from the Soviet Union. And unfortunately, the reality was, it wasn't that simple. China had Chinese issues. Vietnam had Vietnamese issues. And yes, the Soviets did manipulate and get involved in various situations, but they did not dictate what happened in all those places. So the Cold War moves to Asia, and what you're going to see happening...
The deadliest weapon in the world is a Marine and his rifle.
...is eventually a mass military buildup under NSC 68.